All right, sounds good. All right, everyone, so welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our program on studying the sacred copper of the borderlands. Maybe. All right, my name is Janie Adams, and I'm the Curator of Education for the Arizona Historical Society. Joining me also from the Historical Society is Patricia Norman, our Collections Manager, and Nate Samariski, our Registrar. So a little bit about the Arizona Historical Society. The Arizona Historical Society was established by an act of the first territorial legislature, and we are Arizona's oldest historical agency. And we have museums in Tucson, Tempe, Flagstaff, and Yuma. Our mission is connecting people through the power of Arizona's history, and we're really excited to share this program with you because I think it's also connecting people to the history of science and the history of material objects and thinking about how all of those things connect to each other. We have a new license plate, and when you purchase this license plate, you support the Historical Society. So if you're into novelty plates, consider getting one from the Historical Society, and you can do that on the Motor Vehicles Division website. Speaking of our museums, two of our museums are actually currently open, the Arizona History Museum in Tucson and the Arizona Heritage Center in Tempe. We are open Tuesday to Saturday, 10 to 2. You can buy tickets online and plan your visit at azhs.org/tickets. Some exhibition highlights from our two museums. In Tempe, we currently have on display Unframed, a photo journey through the Navajo and Hopi nations with the photography of artist Catherine McKenna. And then just opened last week at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson is Ready to Launch, Arizona's Place in Space. Both are very exciting, and I hope that you will come and see them. Additional virtual programs from the Historical Society. We have a whole calendar of events kind of planned throughout the year. So if you're looking to engage more with Arizona history, we've got a bunch of different programs upcoming. These are just a sample of the next programs. So if you're interested in what the Historical Society has to offer, you can see our full calendar at azhs.org/calendar. And then members get the best deal in history. When you're a member of the Historical Society, you support preservation, collection, exhibition, educational programs, and more. Members get free general admission to all of our museums, a discount in the gift shop, a subscription to the award-winning Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. So consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society to help us keep connecting people to Arizona's past. And for all of that and more, you can visit our website at azhs.org for the latest news and events. And so now I'm going to introduce our presenters. Russell Skronik holds the Houston Endowment Chair for Civic Engagement and is the Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Diversity, College of Arts, and is a professor of anthropology and history at the University of Texas, Rio Grande. And then also joining us this evening is Rich Johnson, who is an award-winning educator, a juror artist, an independent scholar. And Rich, are you joining us from Florida today?
From New Mexico today.
From New Mexico, all right. So I'm gonna turn it over to them. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And there you are.
And have you allowed me to share my screen?
I think you can do that.
All right. Can you see the screen?
It's thinking.
Yeah, it should look familiar.
Yep, there it goes.
Well, I'm going to start off this evening. I'm Russ Skronik, as you've heard, and I want to welcome my sister from North Carolina, my cousin from Massachusetts, our dear friend Nancy Fisher from Tallahassee, Florida, and colleagues from across the country. And to this evening's talk, many of you have contributed to this work through the years, and well, we hope that you'll get a little taste of what our project has come, how it has come about. So let's move forward here. You know, I always like to say it's not our first trip to the rodeo. Rich and I are old in the truest sense of the word friends. We met in our salad years back at Florida State, God help us, more than 40 years ago. We worked together doing archaeological work in Florida and a whole series of different places, including St. Augustine, for Florida State University. We worked on many projects with the National Park Service. We worked together on underwater research projects on 17th and 18th century Spanish and English shipwrecks in Florida. We then, a few years after that, in 1985, worked with none other than Stanley South from the University of South Carolina at the site of the 16th century capital of La Florida, Santa Elena. And we were involved in the analysis of the materials from that. And then, like everything else, life takes over. You know, you have to grow up, take care of children, have regular jobs. And they separated us. They put me on the West Coast. They put Rich on the East Coast, and we remained separated. In 2017, I had the idea to get this project started again, and I decided to start with materials in Florida, where I had first encountered copper material when I was a student at Florida State. And Rich was silly enough, I think it was the third martini that we had, when I said, hey, let's get the band back together. And let's just say that's how the COTBONS project, Copper on the Borderlands of New Spain, came about. Now, the reality of this project is that it may have, quote, started in 2017, but it really started in 2000 and, good Lord, 2000. I was excavating, I was living in California and teaching there, and I excavated this copper vessel that you see right there. And, you know, I look at it and I say, well, geez, it's interesting. In all my years of doing work on Spanish colonial sites, I've never, ever, ever found copper artifacts. Had them on a Spanish shipwrecks, had that stuff, but I'd never found one in the field. And of course, one of the important things about this is I looked, and then I started to look in the literature, and I asked myself, what do we know about it? And I came up with nothing. And I was pretty ashamed at first. I was thinking, wow, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And I said, geez, there are lots of things I really want to know, and that we should try to find out what kind of forms exist in New Spain. What were they used for? Where were they made? Where did they originate? How were they made? You know, this is not modern, go down to the Costco and purchase them. How are they being made? What were they called by the people who used them? And the main thing is, none of these things are really easily known. And, you know, we're not going to hold a seance tonight. We were teasing earlier about that, hauntings and the rest of this thing. We're not going to do that. And so there's only one way to really get at this, and it's research. But you know, we do this using a whole combination of tools that come to us through anthropology, through history, but, you know, this kind of stuff. Sometimes we can use oral history to inform what's going on. We can sometimes use documents. They may provide us with information about the past. Sometimes we can look at people doing things today. We can look at observed behavior, people that might be working copper today. We can also then look at things that come from the archaeological record, or if not in the archaeological record, sometimes in the systemic context, places like churches where items go in and are there potentially for centuries. So the specific kinds of things that we did here, we did a lot of very descriptive work, that is size, weight, you know, looking for nuances on each artifact that we'd look at. We then did some things doing archaeometry, non-destructive archaeometry, to try to understand more about the material makeup of these items. And for those of you who come from a museum background, and especially Trish and others, the word non-destructive is a big deal, because no one wants anyone to go in there and take pieces off. And as a broken down archaeologist, I'd happily give you a piece. But once it goes into the museum, it's not going to happen. And as Rich and I point out, we're not spring chickens. we want to do something that we're able to do now, because to ask permission can sometimes take years to be able to move forward for destructive work. So our work is always non-destructive. As I said, we do try to use documentary information when it's available. That can be true documents. It could be paintings. It could be secondary documents from archaeological work. I will tell you, we do not privilege, that is, we don't say, well, the documents say it, that settles it, we believe it. No, as we often know, what's written down is not always necessarily accurate. We have looked at ethnoarchaeology, the study of modern Mexican coppersmithing. Some of you may know about this place, Santa Clara del Cobre. We'll mention it more in a moment. And we've used oral histories. We've spoken with colleagues that we know that are Episcopalian, Lutheran, and Roman Catholic clergy to try to get some insights into these things. So what ultimately results is a two-pronged project. First is the issue of, why did we look at this French contact site in Mississippi? Why did we do this? Well, I will just say this without being too rude, because I asked one of our colleagues and said, what should we do, about Spanish stuff? And they said, look at the Tunica treasure. To which my response was, it's a French colonial site. There was no answer, but we looked. And you can see the sorts of things that were found there on the right-hand side of this slide. They have things they call kettles, things they call skillets, obviously lids, a brazier for cooking over, a platter. They called something a wine taster, a bowl, a ladle, a skimmer. But what I want to make a point is that, one, none of the stuff on the French colonial sites looks like anything we've seen across the borderlands. That's number one. And number two, and you're going to hear me talk about this as we move forward, all of these terms that I've just listed up here, if I said to you, what is a kettle? That might be a hard thing for you to define, because there can be many types of kettles. What is a skillet? What is a frying pan? What makes one versus another? These are difficult things to identify. Well, over the course of the past 4 years, though it's been pretty tough in the last year, we've looked at about 400 objects from Florida to California. We've done this descriptive work. We've done the archaeometric analysis. We've made some breakthroughs, and I'll mention a few of them with you today. We have found through a colleague in New Mexico that it seems that a vast majority of the stuff that comes into the greater Southwest from Texas to California, we believe is coming out of Western Mexico, Michoacan, which of course was a great center in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica for the making of objects. Copper bells are one of the most famous ones. But Eleanor Barrett wrote about the colonial copper industry back, good Lord, on the order of about 35 years ago. And you can see some of these locations there. So that was one source of information for us that we looked toward. The other thing, though, we asked ourselves some really important questions regarding this was, well, some folks have said, and you'll see this as we talk about these fonts, they'll say, well, this was a gift from the King of Spain. Does that mean that these things were made in Europe and carried here? What could we do? And we discovered the work of out of Oxford University of this flame project that you can see here. And one of the things that they pointed out about copper that was being mined in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, which is the time period that we're talking about here, is that most of the easily retrievable copper in the old world had been gathered in antiquity. And by this later part in time, much of the copper that was being mined in Central Europe in places like Hungary and up in Sweden and such, there's very high in lead content. And so we looked at some of their work, we looked at their ways of describing things, and they said, the other problem we have is when we talk about something that is bronze or it is brass, those are 19th century terms that have very set meanings. And so it might be better to talk about things that these are copper objects, but they are either high in lead or high in zinc or high in tin. And it might be a better way to look at it. And so we've embraced this as one means or one manner of us doing this work. Well, one of the things that the Flame Project said, so now you can all get angry, don't go home yet though. They said, probably the best tool not to use is portable X-ray fluorescence. Well, there it is. That's our portable X-ray fluorescence unit. And it's the old, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We don't deny that. But what's important about this is that we have used this tool. This tool can give us an idea about what these vessels are made up of, the materials that are in them, some percentages, and they can help at least lead us into the variations that might make these distinct. And you can see the two of us here. Rich is the intelligent looking one on the left. I'm the one going, what? But there we are working at Casa San Isidro with the help of Deb Slaney from the Albuquerque Museum. But we use this item, and you know, this is what some of the spectra look like as we're doing it. And I have here just two samples. And it's interesting, here on the left is a vessel from a shipwreck off the coast of Florida. And there on the right is a vessel that is basically the same form, but from a site in Texas. And if you look at those, you don't have to read it real closely, but basically that large peak represents copper. And by God, those pieces are on the order of 98+% pure copper. Very clean. Nothing else is really turning up. The lower peak is actually just a reflection. It doesn't really show anything else except in very, very small quantities. That said, just to show you the difference, here is another vessel from off of a 1733 Spanish ship. And if you look at this readings, you can see there is the breakdown of the percentages of these things. And copper makes up a grand total of about, what does that say? 80%, no, 46%. I better read that carefully. No, 80% of the material. There are concentrations of other things in there, including iron and lead. This is one of the things that helps us point at and think that perhaps this item may have originated in Europe. And of course, it's interesting, it in some ways makes a lot of sense because it's on a ship, and we know this ship was traveling back and forth between the coast of Mexico and Seville and Cadiz in the 18th century. So this kind of analysis provides us with evidence for fabrication techniques. We've been weighing objects, and we'll point out why that's important in a moment. The dimensions and volumes of these vessels, how big they are, how much perhaps liquids they can hold, and other materials as well. The ledger books that we've looked at can also help us sometimes. We get the names of things that are purchased, and they may say this is a such and such an object of copper. Sometimes we get lucky and it will say where they are used. A caso pozolero is the location where the pozzoli is made. That is the kitchen. They'll tell us how many of certain things are purchased. Sometimes the relative sizes of things. They'll use terms like small, regular, medium, or large. Sometimes they'll actually give us the weight of objects when they're being purchased. We always like to joke and say they didn't have Amazon Prime, so they had to pay shipping on this stuff. And so these are items that are recorded in either Spanish pounds or in arrobas. And of course, one of the things that we end up doing with this is we record that and then we translate everything into English pounds and kilograms and everything else. They also sometimes say that these items are tinned, or they may be riveted. You know, the term con clavos. Clavo normally is associated with the word nail, but it can also mean a rivet. But there's confusion, as you can see here. Differences in spelling. Some are pretty clear cut. But what is the difference between something that's called a caso in one place and another one that seems very much like the same thing. They're calling it an olla. Or in some places, we see a term used for a vessel made for making chocolate, and they'll call it a small cauldron, a caldereta, and another place they'll call it a jarro. You know, these are things that you have to take into account. Is there a difference, or is it just one person calling it something a skillet and someone else calling it a frying pan? It may be as simple as that. So very quickly, I want to go through some of our findings before I turn it over for the good stuff. This is one of our great discoveries that was made. I think it's a great discovery when the machine decided not to work in the Albuquerque Museum basement, and Deb Slaney got to see me turn purple and have blue smoke come out of my ears. But while we waited to get the machine operating, I started to look at all their copper vessels, and lo and behold, we discovered that day that there are 3 distinct forms and sizes, and we could lay them out. There were small ones of these vessels. This is a simple sheet of copper, beaten up in the shape, holes punched through it, and a handle placed on it. Slightly larger ones had to have reinforcements for the handles. And you can see this here in the drawing and in the vessel form. And then there are large ones. Some of these things go up to more than 100 pounds that we've identified through these times. So we see different sizes that we can then take and match up with the documents. Here are these chocolate pots that I've already shown you, and these are ones that are from California and Texas and Florida, and one of them is currently in the, that one on the top left is in the Peabody Museum, but it's from the Channel Islands off of California, the Santa Barbara region. And of course, here on the bottom right is an early 18th century tile showing chocolate being made. And you can see the fellow on the left is actually whisking it up over the brazier. And the fellow on the bottom right who's kneeling down is pouring the chocolate out into the cups. These are what these forms are. So we recognize this. We've also then started finding these large vessels that are riveted together out of pieces. And you know, that's kind of threw us, what's the difference? And it was real interesting. We found terms in the documents that refer to a fondo, that's a deep pot or a deep vessel, con clavos, with rivets. And we look at these 3 things, or these 4 different ones here, and we found them in other places. And these seem to always be associated with activities that require high amounts of heat, something that might be from making soap or candles or things like this, not just regular cooking, but something that may be more industrial. And lo and behold, stills, alembics. And if you look at these, they're all riveted together. And if you know anything about making alcohol, you have to boil this stuff. And if you'll notice, there they're the vessels, they're riveted together. And in fact, a number of these that we've examined, actually the bottoms of them are basically burned out because they've been burned or fired for such a long period of time. So we start to pick up that kind of form. But this isn't what you came for. You came tonight to find about what we're calling, you know, sacred copper. And, you know, for us, sacred copper are a number of copper alloy objects that we associate with the Roman Catholic Church. They can include mortars for celebrations. I'll point that out in a moment. Religious metals, a chalice could also be a goblet. You know, how does one define another? Holy water buckets, baptismal shells, and ultimately baptismal fonts. This is an example, a cross-section of some of the items that we've looked at through time. A baptismal on the left. In the center is a holy water bucket with scalloping around it. You can see that. A chalice on the right, or a goblet. One in the Smithsonian. The one on below is from the Peabody Museum. The mortars on the bottom right, and a shell, copper shell vessel for use in baptism. Well, it's interesting. People say, well, what about fireworks? Well, we know they would purchase fireworks by the gross for churches. They'd be put off on holy times, weddings, all kinds of festivals. And we know they had everything for firecrackers and cartwheels to skyrockets, basically bottle rockets. These items on the right, these mortars are made of leaded bronze or leaded copper, and they're very heavy, so they can be held upright. Here are a couple of religious medals. These are from, again, the collection from the Channel Islands, and you can see they fall in a category on the bottom left of this chart that we would refer to today as brass, but of course they vary in content of zinc from 25 to 30%. So these are not hard and fast, but they do fall in these categories. Here are the two chalices that you saw before out of the Peabody and the Smithsonian, and you will notice that both of these fall in this category that would be in the aspect of leaded copper, so that they are distinct. Here's the holy water buckets that we showed you before. What helps us understand what they are is that scalloped form that you see at the mouth of the vessels up there, and I'll talk to you about that next. We take all those kinds of items, and then we look at what the ledgers say to us. Here from Mission San Diego, you can see dated 1773, 1 pila baptismal de Cobre, 57 pounds, okay? And there you can see it in the original handwriting. It's easy to read. Any of us who grew up having to write cursive can read this stuff. My students can't anymore, but we can. At Museum La Purísima Concepcion, and again, these are in California, 1 pila bautismal, 24 pounds, and it cost them not $12, but 12 pesos. And so you can see that. Some of the ledgers gave accessories with them. Mission Soledad says a pila bautismal, and it says, con a concha y candado, a shell and a lock. And the same is true when we look at Santa Cruz, where it says a baptismal font with a shell, a concha, and a candado, a lock. So we see that these things are being purchased and they're accessories. It also tells us something about how these things are put together and used. And finally, I just want to point out this issue about the shell and why the shell is so important on the holy water bucket and baptismals and everything else. And Rich will go into it more. But the scallop is the symbol of baptism in Christianity. The dish used by the priest is often scallop shaped. Pour it over the head. These ones are copper. One has been found in the Alamo in Texas that is thought to be silver. I'm hoping to analyze that in a few weeks. It's also associated with St. James of Compostela, also known as Santiago, who is the patron saint of Spain. And these are the shell that we see here, that the metal one is from San Juan Bautista in California. The one on the top with the blue shell is from Mission San Fernando in California. And the one on the bottom is in Mission San Juan Capistrano. And you can see how the shells are depicted in the churches to this day. Now, at this point, we will turn it over to Rich, and we will just simply say, take it away, Rich.
May the fonts be with you. Thank you, Russ. I appreciate it. The fonts were a pretty spectacular artifact in all reality, something we had not anticipated in our study, but they turned out to be spectacular in a number of ways. Number one, this project started out as a formal analysis. How are things shaped to function, etc.? Well, we've been able to look at 3 different forms for these baptismal fonts. So it worked for our formal analysis. We also were blessed with the X-ray fluorescence unit. And it was the X-ray fluorescence unit that helped us, we think, understand where these things originated and very probably who made them. And the third thing, and to me, one of the most interesting things, was to find that every font that we were able to look at had the ideography and symbolism of the Roman Catholic Church during that time period, 1540 to 1830, thereabouts. That's made it very fascinating. So we have three ways of looking at these fonts, and it's pretty much the only class of artifacts that allows us to do that. So if we take a look at the three different forms, let's look at the at form 1, for example. We could think about form 1, but we could also look at it. There we go. Okay, so form 1 is measured by a domed lid. They're slightly domed lids made out of a single piece of copper, a single sheet of copper, but they have a bulbous belly. So when you start looking at these particular fonts, look at the swell of the belly on the body of these particular fonts. So let's take a look at some examples. Here are two really good examples of form 1. Both of these vessels, both of these fonts have slightly domed lids. You can see the one for Mission San Diego appears to be less complex than the design elements on the form 1 example from San Buenaventura, one of the most intriguing of the baptismal fonts that we saw from a symbolism standpoint. But again, looking at the body, I think you can see the swell of the body on these. And eventually I want you to look at that because we will also see form 2 and form 3. And it's the swell of this body form that we think makes them a little bit different. So let's go a little further here. This is another example, very possibly of form 1, hard to tell because it's encased in what appears to be a limestone structure. It could also easily be form 3, but because we can't see the entire vessel itself, we're putting it into form 1. We think that the chain of evidence on this particular font may be the cleanest that we've got, and it may be the oldest font that we were looking at. We're not 100% certain of that either, but it's certainly one of the older ones, and we'll explain why in a moment. Let's go a little further.
And with any luck, we'll find that out when we're there this summer, right?
That's correct. When we look at iconography, the symbolism that are embedded in each of these fonts, this is the one of the fonts from San Buenaventura. Take a look at what is probably the only design element that you might call narrative. An intense amount of scalloping, concentric rings, but inside the concentric rings, you find this two-headed avian icon, two-headed bird. And we wonder, where would that come from? We looked at one possibility coming from the Habsburg eagle. The Habsburg eagle were really big supporters of the Jesuit order, back in the day. That's not to say that this was Jesuit, but it's a reference that we're seeing. When you look at the two-headed eagle and the Habsburg icon, they look like they're pretty predatory creatures. Not so much in this particular font from San Buenaventura. And one of the questions was, could it be that it was a local craftsman, maybe a Michoacan? And they really were using the example of the Quetzal bird, used heavily in Michigan legend and mythology. Beneath the two-headed icon, you see the body of the bird is a heart. You see hearts in a lot of Jesuit iconography, as well as the teardrop shape, which also appears in the middle of the heart. And it's hard to see in this one, but growing out of the center of the font, growing out of the center of the teardrop shape inside the heart shape, is what we found on every font. And they had a leaded copper cross. You will also look and you'll see feathered wings on the sides of the heart, and of course, the tail feathers as well. Again, interesting iconography. We're just kind of throwing this guess out there. We think it might relate to the Habsburg eagle. It could be that the bird form was from a local craftsman who said, the Quetzals, they're more important to us, and the head shape is a bit different. But what a wonderful example of intense craftsmanship. Back in the day, I raised a copper vessel. I was trained how to do that. I was trained how to do repoussé. I was trained how to chase copper. That's how these things were made. And I can tell you right now, the person that did this was highly skilled and highly trained. And one of the things that we're finding as we look at the history of the missions in Alta California and in the area in Arizona, New Spain, the missions were not training people in that particular type of craftsmanship. They trained them in blacksmithing and other routines, but not coppersmithing. So another reason why we think these may have been made possibly in Michoacan or Santa Clara de Cobre or someplace in Western Mexico. Let's go a little step farther. Here is really complex iconography. And this will carry over in its own way into Form 2 and certainly in Form 3. We all have probably seen, if you look at the center of the box on the left, that fish symbol. You've seen it in chrome on the back of cars all throughout the country. The fish symbol was, of course, a symbol of Christ. In Greek, the word for fish was ichthys. And in the spelling of ichthys was iota, chi, theta, what is that last one? Upsilon and sigma. And the interesting thing about those 5 letters is the first letter, iota, is the first letter of the word Jesus in Greek, etc. You know, chi for Christ, theta of God, upsilon, Son, sigma, Savior. Now, what they did, they took each of those letters. If you look at the bottom, you see the red area and the black area. The red area shows you what's known as the wheel of Christ. But the individual black areas are repetitions of the Greek letters, iota, chi, theta, upsilon, and sigma. When you superimpose those 5 letters on top of one another, you wind up with an 8-part wheel. If you look in the center photograph and the drawing of that same baptismal font lid as seen from the top, you wind up with 8 lobes or 8 portions in almost a pizza or 8-spoked Christian wheel. And this was from the font at San Diego. The number 8 comes from the theological 8, historically referenced. Theological 8 comes from the classic 7, 6 days of creation, and the 7th day when God rested. But the 8th day comes along with the appearance of Christ. And the appearance of Christ is what baptism was all about. Christ died, he resurrected, and he exposed the idea of eternal life. In the Roman Catholic Church, baptism was, I hate to say deadly serious, but it was. In essence, when you enter the area, the sacrament of baptism, you die, you are reborn, and you are invited to enter the eternal life offered by Jesus Christ. This kind of symbolism is embedded in the majority of the baptismal fonts that we've seen. The wheel of Christ was an absolute, it was a piece of, iconography, graffiti that was used in the 2nd and 3rd century on buildings or areas to let Christians who were under fire at the time know you're safe here. Look for the wheel. Okay, Russ, let's go a little step further. This was also Form 1. This goes back to San Javier del Bac, south of Tucson in Arizona. There's the IHS ideogram that relates directly to the Jesuit order. The Jesuits, of course, were in New Spain up until about 1767, 1768, when they were expelled by the king. They were expelled all over Europe as well. They survived in a few areas, but they took this symbol, Jesus hominum salvator, Jesus, Savior of men, probably around the 16th century when the order was founded. But the Roman Catholic Church took this symbol in the 7th and 8th century. Russ mentioned at the prelude when we were just kind of meeting about this presentation that I was an altar boy back in the day, and I was. And I remembered a priest telling me about IHS. And the IHS he told me was, I have suffered. Well, I thought I remembered that. I visited my family about 2 weeks ago, and my brother, Ray, who's watching, is always willing to chime in ahead of the game. And I was explaining to my 100-year-old mother, happy birthday, Mom, recently. I said, Mom, you remember what they told us about IHS? And Ray dove right, yeah, I have suffered. Just reaffirming what I believed that I had heard as well. He also was an altar boy. So that's our iconography. That relates to most of all of Form 1 and Form 3. So let's move a step farther, Russ. And we're going to take a look at Form 2. Form 2 is diametrically different from each of the fonts that we've just looked at and the iconography in those fonts. Form 2 is very, very simple. It's a very plain design. The bowl is a bit more shallow. It seems wider, flatter. It's got a very low-lying lid. It's simple in the sense that there's no real decoration, no real repoussé elevation of a design element. It's a simple bowl with a lip, but that flat, the flat lid is bifurcated. So let's take a look at the dramatic difference between Form 1 and Form 2. This is the baptismal font on the lower left and lid from Mission San Gabriel. Interesting thing about this particular font is I was looking at examples of baptismal fonts at the Vatican, and the only example of any of the fonts that we looked at in Arizona or California was this one. They had a painting of this particular baptismal font from San Gabriel. Mission San Gabriel's had a very difficult year with a pretty destructive fire this year. We wish those people well. Russ had talked about the ledgers, and what he's done here is he's highlighted the fact that there is a reference to baptismal de Cobre, 71 pounds. If you look just below the right-handed arrow, you can see that in a smaller form out of the original ledger, and it's blown up there in the top left. Now, one of the other interesting things about these every one of the fonts that we saw in Form 2 were virtually identical in size and execution. So let's take a look at some of the iconography from these forms. Here again, we have San Gabriel on the left, dated 1771. Mission San Luis Obispo, 1772, virtually identical. You see a body that is chased. That is not a welded or soldered extra portion. That is still made out of one sheet of copper. But each of them have that chasing about 2/3 down the way of the bowl. But look again at the top, the one on San Antonio, 1774, looking down on the lid. Think about the iconography that we were seeing in Form 1 and ask yourself if you see anything there that is reminiscent of anything that we exposed you to when we were looking at the other iconography. And now Russ will reveal the iconography that we believe comes from Form 2. There's no reference to this. We've never read anything about this. We've never heard about that. But we do know that Rome, the Vatican, had given out orders that they were not going to dictate how you put together baptismal fonts, particularly on the frontier. But they said it should be appropriately designed. So they gave the local artisans a certain amount of freedom. When you look at the circular form, purely circular form, each of those forms bisected in the middle, it also could be a reference to the Greek letter theta, which we saw in the middle of the other reference from Form 1. Don't know if it's true. We think it may be real. We would be interested in any input from those who have a bit more knowledge about Roman Catholic symbolism than we do. But it's a fascinating coincidence, if nothing else. So let's move forward now and take a look at Form 3. Form 3, I want you again thinking about Form 1 with the swollen belly and the shallow lid. Form 3 is noted because the body of the font is made of 2 sheets of copper, and they are soldered at about the midway point, not chased as in Form 2, but soldered. And there is a gentle lid in some cases, but this particular form seems a bit steeper. And these lids are all lobed. Lobed meaning, again, the pizza lobing of the 8 lobes, etc. There are a couple of variations in Form 3. So we're going to take a look at these. This is a fascinating font in and of itself. If you take a look at the picture on the right, dead center of the lid, you can see that kind of gaping hole right out of the middle. That's where the leaded cross, as we saw evidence in every font, would have emerged. If you look at the lobes, there are only 3 lobes in this particular font, possibly representing the Holy Trinity. That would be our guess. This is located at Mission San Fernando in California. Look at the steepness of this particular font, much steeper than any of the other fonts that we looked at. But this also happens to be unique, and it's about half the size. It's like the little brother of every other font that we were able to view. Let's look at some others. Okay, here we have from Mission San Luis Rey an example, a really good example of what we think is classic Form 3. You have the drawing on the left looking straight down on the top, and if you count the lobes, there are 8 lobes, and you can see them reflected in the photograph in the middle. Slightly better in the photography, you can see, again, the leaded copper cross emanating from the center of the font. Looking again at the belly of the font, you have the soldered seam about halfway down, and you don't have the swollen belly. The belly kind of tapers from its widest point below the lid down to its base, a rather gentle taper. And that seems to be fairly standard with these Form 3s. Let's take a look at another example. This one was interesting. This was from Mission Santa Ynez. Again, look at the lobes in the drawing and in the upper left-hand corner and the lower left-hand corner. And even though the design elements are not the swollen lobes that we see, this is more like a necktie design with a very flat lid, but the eight lobes are there. Once again, the Christian wheel is reflected. The interesting thing about the font with Santa Ynez is once again, we see the soldered seam around the midpoint of the belly. You can see the flat lid, and of course the locks that were required by the Vatican, by Rome for the baptismal fonts. But it's hard to see in this photograph, but it's one of the only fonts where we saw that's what I still would call a bit of a narrative design, possibly a river of life design or a snake-like design that is repoussé and chased into the bottom of this particular font. There's only one other baptismal font where we saw the bottom heavily designed, heavily executed, probably even to a greater extent than this one. Let's go, and this is the one. This is the font that is housed at the Arizona Historical Society. It's stunningly gorgeous. The paintwork is beautiful. It's been preserved wonderfully. The chain of evidence we have for this particular font seems to relate to La Purísima Concepción in Caborca, Sonora in Mexico, just south of the border of Arizona and Mexico. But it is stunningly beautiful. Once again, you see the scalloping kind of around the center piece. You see the area where the cross would have been placed, scalloping again, very special meaning for both St. James, the patron saint of Spain, but also for baptism. And again, you have the 8 lobes. And we know that these fonts were probably painted, probably with gold and red and green paint. And this is just a great example of that. And I want to take and look at again the centerpiece. If you have the left-hand picture, you see the cross hatching in the red paint. The next slide shows the incredible uniqueness of this particular font. We're going to be looking at the bottom of this particular font. And that font is heavily decorated more than any of the others. So Russ, you're going to have to move us up a step. There you go. So this is the same font housed at the Arizona Historical Society Museum. The most complex decoration at the base of the bowl. In each case, you've got, this is the bottom again, an additional 8 lobes. Beautifully repousséd, beautifully chased. And then you'll see coming out of the center, another 8 twice. So just a spectacular example of the baptismal fonts that were being produced probably in Mexico, out of Michoacan, possibly Santa Clara del Cobre. And you members of the Arizona Historical Society, go to the museum and take a look at this. Sometimes you have a huge array of spectacular artifacts in that museum. This is one that's got a wonderful story, and it's really worth your visit to the museum. Take a close look at it if you get that chance. So what I want to do now is take a look at one more, which was very curious. This is the font from Mission San Jose. Very good chain of evidence going back to 1810 that this is the original font for that mission, at least from that time forward. Once again, we're looking at a ledger book that talks about Liemo el Bautismos. This font was unique for one reason, and it makes me really think, and Russ as well, there is intentional decoration on the lids of these fonts. Let's take a look at the lid of this font. Same font, beautiful picture showing the leaded copper cross emanating from the center. You can again see the gentle sloping inward of the base, the seam at the middle. But what's really unique is counting the lobes in this particular font. There are 14 lobes. Who would do that? Who would say, let's put 14 in there? Where does that come from? And doing a little bit of research, there is a biblical, theological value to the number 14. The number 14, back in the day, at a time when they considered a generation to be 35 years, they look at 14 generations coming from Abraham to David, basically 14 times 35 years. There's another 14 generations from David to what's called the Babylon captivity. Babylon captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon defeated the Assyrians, and Judah happened to be a subset of Assyria. They didn't like paying tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. So the Babylon captivity referred to Nebuchadnezzar taking control of the leading politicians, the leading military people, the leading religious people, and said, they're going to be staying with me until you decide to pay your tribute, which after 3 or 4 years, they finally did. And then another 14 years to the emergence of Jesus. So you have 3 sets of 14 generations, and they always refer to the 14 generations. But the 14 generations really come from the 7, the 6 days, the 7th day, God rests. So you have 2 sets of 7 in each 14, and that gives you a total of 6 sets of 7, and then you have the arrival of Jesus Christ. And the arrival of Jesus Christ is the 7th 7. Again, powerful numerology in the Roman Catholic Church and in Christianity in general. And again, the emergence of Jesus Christ, we get back into the suffering and your own death, paralleling the death of Jesus Christ, the resurrection. As you get baptized, you are resurrected, and then you're invited into eternal life with Jesus Christ. So that even that 14 has powerful significance. And when you think of 14 lobes, you don't do that on a whim. There's a conscious reason for doing it. And we're certainly open to any other interpretations of these. The theological 8 is very clearly defined, the theological 14 as well. So we welcome any invitation from those in the know to say, well, you may be off base or not. So let's take a look at what we learned here with this particular project, the COTBONS project. Number one, there's a broad spectrum of copper vessels, all of those that Russ had mentioned earlier in the presentation. And those vessels are 3 basic categories: personal hygiene, cooking, the kitchen, etc., and religion, which we tried to focus on in the latter half of this presentation. We're trying to discover the vessel nomenclature that may be associated with specific forms. And the ledgers have helped us with that to a certain extent. But even if you looked at the ledger examples that we showed you today, there are some slight variations with the way they spelled things out or defined particular items. We believe, because of the distinct lack of lead in the copper itself, that most of these vessels were made in Mexico. It's not to say that we didn't find lead, but the lead that we found, particularly in areas like the baptismal fonts, was always in the areas of the fonts that were painted. And we were finding that lead reflected only in that, not in the copper itself. So we're convinced that the origin of all of these fonts is in Mexico. In fact, we believe that the vast majority of the copper objects that we've seen in this project, the nearly 400 objects, most of them originate in Mexico. Another thing is the incredible sophistication of the craftsmen, particularly with the fonts. That is not to say that the Native Americans, the indigenous people, weren't highly skilled. They certainly were. You take a look at pre-Columbian art in Mexico, etc., and it is spectacular. It is highly sophisticated. It is intelligent. Their own form of symbolism is built into it. But in the mission system, the training that was done in the mission system, we saw no example of any training anywhere in the mission system that speaks of copper craftsmanship, coppersmithing. So we learned a little bit of how Spanish colonial era baptismal fonts were in their decoration encoded with the iconography associated with Christianity, specifically the Roman Catholic Church and Spain. But they may have been modified with New World imagery, specifically referring to San Buenaventura. We're really interested because I know there's some people listening that have probably a deeper experience working in that particular area, and particularly with these items. So we're really anxious to get some feedback from some of you who are listening tonight. Russ, you want to wrap it up? Russ was wrapping it up silently.
I was muted. I couldn't find it.
I warned you about that muting situation earlier.
Yeah, well, you know, it happens. But we do want to thank everyone in Arizona and across California that helped us. Many of you will see your names here. We're going to be coming down there to bother Bob Vint and Matilda Rubio and Tim Lewis, hopefully in July, and meeting with other folks down at the Amarind in July as well. But you can see folks from all over California that were really helpful to us through time on this project. The last thing, again, this is how we end all our projects, trying to find the watering hole, but we also find them along the way. So we'll have to check out the brews when we're back in Arizona. We have been fortunate to have support for this project from my university, and because I hold the endowed chair in the Houston Endowment, has helped support a lot of our work. And if any of you would like to be in touch or send me, dunning emails, there is my email address that's coming up. So I will stop sharing at this point and throw it open for comments, questions, and scathing rebuttals.
Yeah, if you've got some questions or a comment, you can put that in the chat. But one of the questions that came in during the course of the presentation is thinking about, how can we use these objects? How can we use all this information that we've gathered about these objects to better understand how people lived? Is there any kind of indication from the data that you've pulled that really talk about how, how this impacted everyday people? Yeah.
Well, I think one way we can treat this is it's interesting where we see these copper vessels, and I'm not thinking about the baptismal fonts because that's very specialized. That's a single purpose item. But when we look at that other range of materials, from cooking vessels to personal hygiene, we didn't have it in there. We found chamber pots made out of copper. We found a whole series of different things. But it's real interesting when we look in our salad years back in Florida. There were missions there established in the 17th century and into the 18th century. Copper is virtually invisible. You never find it. We find it on these shipwrecks, but not at these sites. And that's one of the reasons why our colleagues there didn't know what to say about it. And the main reason is because those folks there were, ceramic people. They were making ceramics for thousands of years. Obviously, you come into places like New Mexico and Arizona, you've got a deep ceramic tradition as well. But when you come into Texas, when you come into California, and was my last life was in California, no, these were ceramic people. And of course, one thing that happens when you start seeing the establishment of these missions, especially among folks that had been originally, semi-sedentary hunters, gatherers, and fisher folk, and they're coming into missions, and all of a sudden it's a different food regime and everything else. You need new ways of preparing new foods, and a lot of the foods, and we all know, have to be cooked for long periods of time. We all have not cooked the beans long enough, and we know what that does to us. Yes, and so it's like having a crock pot, but in this case, we see more of this stuff in these other locations, so it turns up more frequently. Of course, that changes when we, like in California where I was working, by the 1790s and into the beginning part of the 19th century, people had the missions were trade schools, and people learned how to make ceramics. They were learning how to make other things, and so the metal is there, but it does not play as much of a role later in the 19th century or the first half of the 19th century as it did earlier. But it does give us insights into what these things are. But I will tell you is that, and I'm gonna add one thing to this, Jamie, is when we've presented this at the Society for Historical Archaeology and other conferences, and I've said to people, so who can tell me the difference between a skillet and a frying pan? And it's amazing how everyone's shoes got really interesting. You go into a kitchen, and if someone says to you, hand me a pot, the first response is, which pot? Mm-hmm. How do we define these things? And much of our language is very sloppy. Mm-hmm. And yet we know that certain types, you're going to use for certain things. But anyway, I don't know if that answered the question, but there we go.
Okay, I'll give you 2 cents. One of the things we noticed with the kazos, the pots, for example, these were highly valued. We saw so many examples of these pots with patch after patch after patch in order to keep these things functional. Yep. So they were durable, but boy, if they cracked one or something was going wrong, they found a way to patch them. Think of the volume, Russ, the volume of the pots in general that we've seen and how many of them were patched time and time again.
It's true.
There's another question kind of related, and I thought it was really interesting in your presentation. talking about how these objects kind of move, you know, not only because of, you know, the wheelings and dealings of institutions and how collections pieces move around, but also thinking a deeper history of, you know, potentially pillage or theft. So how can we use this information to, you know, heal some cultural wounds, right? Is there any work that you know of that's being done to help kind of reunite some of these pieces with their homes?
You have really touched, you've touched on about three important things, including raw nerves in places. You know, there are many people, and I don't want to get in trouble with you guys, but many people say, why would you work with museum collections? You don't know where they're from. The stuff has remained in the systemic context for perhaps hundreds of years, you know, this sort of thing. You don't know where they came from. They said, you know, that can be questionable to use that data. And we were confronted with that with my colleagues from the Smithsonian, who said, you know, this is something you should think about. And I said, well, we are thinking about it because one of the important things about the museum collections is we can get at this question of form. You know, we can see certain forms that are out there. Oftentimes when we look at the archaeological record, many of the forms are crushed, as the original one is that I showed you, or what we see there are just fragments. And you can think about why that is. You know, I'll quote my father: if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? The thing about these copper vessels is they're durable. As Rich pointed out, God knows we saw some that had patch on top of patch on top of patch, but they're durable and they can last for long periods of time. So one of the things that became for us all crucial, and that's one of the reasons why we've looked at collections in, I don't care if it's Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. We've looked at archaeological collections because, you know, we go and we say, well, we all agree this is archaeological. It's from the ground. We know where it came from. We get what we can form-wise, but what we can get using the PXRF is something of a signature of the metal. What does it look like? And what has been a godsend for us by being able to do that is we look at this and we go, man, this is the metal from these archaeological contexts. It gives us this signature. How does the stuff in the museums match up? How do the baptismal fonts that never were in the archaeological record match up? And that's why, as Rich put it, we look and we say, we feel pretty good about these fonts having been made in Mexico and brought here. And it's real interesting. Sorry, I'm going to just for a second, just a little deeper. When we were looking at one place in California, they said, well, according to legend, it was made by the resident Native American community. And boy, I read that and I'm going, no one's going to like this. And we went through it. But what we said is this: it doesn't mean that the resident Native American community did not work on that font at some point. And that's what Rich was making the case for. We know that in California, people were blacksmiths, there were potters, there were joiners, there were, you know, carpenters, you name it. There were folks that made bricks and, you know, all this stuff. They were trained in these ways. We know blacksmiths could fix these pots, and we see the corrections on it. But that kind of, we have no evidence that anyone was doing that kind of repoussé work. Doesn't mean that they weren't involved in painting the churches or anything else, but we just don't have evidence of a copper industry per se in the northern borderlands. We'll find small scraps of copper to repair things, but we don't see people as a true workshop. We know, going back to that work from the professor at the University of New Mexico, there were guilds, true guilds in the sense of the stuff we grew up with thinking about Europe, in Mexico City and in Michoacan at Santa Clara del Cobre, where these folks were engaged in making this copper work. And by God, they're doing it to this day. And if we can ever get there, it's kind of a little of a hot region right now, but we're going to get there. Sorry, that was more than you wanted to hear.
No, I think that's a great answer, right? I think, you know, as museum professionals, it's kind of always in the back of our mind where it's like, well, where did this really come from?
Well, let me actually, I'm going to give you one other thing though that'll make you it'll make everyone crazy. While we were working on this manuscript, and I was up to my eyeballs in those documents, and we're fine. You know, we don't have documents for every one of the sites that we've got baptismals, but we had it for some, and it drove us crazy because there was this description of the baptismal font from Mission San Diego, and they gave a weight. It doesn't come anywhere close to the weight of the actual vessel that's there. But when we look at the weight on the one from San Gabriel and the others, we're going, well, that's interesting. These are pretty close weight-wise in there, and that's why we were going from Spanish pounds to English pounds and everything else. So it becomes this question of, like you said, can we reunite certain things with certain locations? And it makes us wonder if maybe the original font got passed down to some new parish that was developed, you know, you name it, in 1880, and it's still out there. Or it may be in a barn, or during World War II, it might have been picked up as scrap and sold for the war effort.
We also know from speaking to the people, you know, in the missions that there's a lot of shuffling going on, you know, of fonts being moving back and forth. The one at San Fernando, for example, we talked to the archivist there, and they said, we got this after the fact. We can't give you a chain of evidence for this particular font. And the fact of the matter is, we were very certain that after 1767, you know, when the Jesuits were kicked out pretty much everywhere, but certainly from New Spain, a lot of those vessels in the churches were probably put in some kind of storage, because even in Mission San Miguel, we found what was clearly a Jesuit portable font with the Jesuit icon on top of it as well. So there's a constant bit of shuffling. You know, you had that period where the missions basically went secular. There's stories about the people gathering the holy relics, taking them into their homes, and then bringing them back to the church, you know, when the churches came back and it took back over. It's a fascinating story, but the question that you asked is right on the money, and it's pretty hard to sort out. And you wonder if the PXRF or some more sophisticated instrument down the line can give us some of that information. You know, we've looked at the alloys in the copper and the trace elements. We focus more on the alloys because it talks more about human behavior, but the trace elements may eventually give us some sense of where that specific mine was as opposed to another. It's a fascinating area of study, and we've just been dipping into it.
Well, definitely. Well, we're running a little bit long. So Russ, if it's okay with you, I'm going to post your email address in the chat in case anyone has any lingering questions, or bolt out of bed at 2:30 in the morning and go, I have to know. So, well, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. You know, I think it's really inspiring the ways that we can take history and the arts and humanities and science and have them talk to each other in really meaningful ways. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And for everyone out in the audience, thank you for being with us tonight. A recording of tonight's session will be available in about 2 weeks or 10 days, give or take. If you have any lingering questions, I've posted Russ's email address in the chat, and I hope that everyone has a lovely